Jó estét kívánok! Kívánok! Good evening. Deputy Prime Minister, Ministers, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. John, thank you so much for the generous introduction. My mother would actually believe it. And warm congratulations to the Danube Institute and the Botiani Lawyers Foundation. And I agree with you that in our region we need more debate and less partisanship. An excellent initiative. It's a great privilege and pleasure. And let me start with some diplomatic dark art technique. What's the first thing a foreign ministry does when a speaking invitation such as this arrives? It uses the most sophisticated electronic techniques to check the About Us page on the website of the people sending it. And the Danube Institute website tells me that the Institute provides an independent center of intellectual debate for conservatives and classical liberals and their democratic opponents in Central Europe. More, it even mentions names, including John O'Sullivan and Jerry Frost. Now, some Central Europeans might say that it is highly suspicious that two Brits are here in Budapest, leading a new institute for conservative and classical liberals. But I know them both. John has already stolen my best line by reminding us about the article. Indeed, it was published in January '89, and I'm very proud of the cover, which I treasure. And Jerry ran an institute where I met a legendary figure of Soviet studies called Leo Labets. And I can't remember whether it was at the institute or somewhere else, but he coined one of my favorite phrases about the Soviet Union, about Soviet historians. Leo said, Soviet historians, being Marxists, know their future with certainty. What they have trouble with is their ever-changing past. Now, I'm wondering whether I was invited here as a conservative, a classical liberal, or one of their democratic opponents. But John's invitation was characteristically open-ended. Speak as you like on foreign policy, the more topical the better. If you wish to sketch out the way forward from the still undetermined, at that time, Ukraine crisis, that would be perfect. Should you deliver an enthusiastic endorsement of European federalism, we hardened old Eurosceptics will bite our tongues and applaud with every appearance of compliance. Well, let me take John at his word and talk about foreign policy in general and Europe's foreign policy in particular. But to do justice to this fine occasion and the bold intellectual spirit which I hope will characterize the Institute, I'll try to make an astonishing metamorphosis here before your eyes. And let me change the habits of the last few years and just for this evening join the camp of hardened Eurosceptics to see what things might look like from their perspective on foreign policy. And I propose to ignore the lunatic fringe that sees the EU as a conspiracy of Masons or big business or a delicious combination of the two. What does it mean these days to be a mainstream, democratic Eurosceptic? Hard like John, or sweet and soft-centered like Jerry? People are Eurosceptic for many different reasons. As Tolstoy famously said, all the happy people who support the EU are alike. Each Eurosceptic is unhappy in his own particular way. Some Eurosceptics don't accept the very idea of the EU, or that national sovereignty is subject to lawmaking powers at a higher level. Others accept the EU in principle, but argue that in practice it goes too far. They fear post-democratic policy making by unaccountable Brussels elites. They insist that ever closer union through the Eurozone creates dangerous economic and even moral contradictions. Country-specific Eurosceptics are yet another category. They don't care whether other countries join the European Union. They may welcome it. They may even think that the EU is terrific, a force for good and glory. They just don't want their own country to be in it. As you all know, Poland has one of the highest pro-Europe ratings among voters anywhere in the EU. And it's actually grown as a reaction to the events in Ukraine, reaching recently an all-time high of 82% approval. But we too have our Eurosceptic tendencies. People moaning that it took decades to free Poland from communist oppression within the Warsaw Pact. Do we really have to submit, they say, to rules coming from Brussels? What do these species and subspecies of Euroscepticism have in common? They believe that Europe's citizens can capture key benefits flowing from the European Union, peace, prosperity, global influence, without something like the EU's institutional and legal structure. Now, today I don't want to talk about the economic aspects of EU's success. For me, it's clear that huge practical benefits come to all of us from the single market, and that to make that market work, we need rules agreed by member states, sharing and pooling their sovereignty. And crucially, that those benefits would not come otherwise. Instead, I want to talk about the EU's external policy and show to you, hopefully prove to you, that Eurosceptics should like what they see. Let's start with establishing what actually is a foreign policy. Some people say that it's wrong even to have one. Why don't states just mind their own business? Stop trying to meddle far beyond their borders in things they don't understand, and usually making a mess in the process. Others reply that all states have no choice but to think about how they protect themselves and how they advance their interests. That means investing in understanding the rest of the world and taking action in many different ways. Above all, projecting a coherent view of how the world should be run, working hard to persuade others that that view makes sense, using levers of tough and soft power to make things happen. When the First World War started, far fewer states existed. Europe itself had empires: British, French, German, Russian, Ottoman, and of course the dual monarchy, run in good part from this great capital of Budapest. These empires loftily directed the affairs of much of humanity. The elegant boulevards, the imposing buildings of those times remain with us in Europe's cities. They are monuments to a vast history of European power and prestige. Our empires have gone, but instincts and ambitions remain. Europeans of all political complexions, including most Eurosceptics, believe in European countries taking an active role in world affairs. We do not agree with Candide that we should limit our ambitions to our own garden. So, having agreed that we do want to have a foreign policy that is more than platitudinous statements, the next question arrives: how to have influence and impact in today's complicated world? And let's look at some examples. Can any one European country, or indeed any country, drive forward a credible plan for stabilizing Syria and, more generally, the troubled Middle East region? I say no. Can any one European country tackle those swarms of postmodern pirates now plaguing the high seas of Africa? No. Can any one European country contain terrorist threats from far-flung parts of the world? No. Can any one European country promote positive change in North Korea or other countries where human rights are massively abused? Again, no. Can any one country make any difference in the Kashmir issue or anywhere else in Asia where tensions are rising? No. I think Euroscepticism, skepticism in general, is about realism. And I think we all recognize reality. Europeans need to work together to make a difference anywhere outside Europe. And this means pooling our efforts and resources and insights. Hardened Eurosceptics also agree that we need to pool our efforts to manage problems directly affecting Europe and even within Europe. Is it better to talk to the countries of North Africa separately or as a team? Is it better to negotiate with Turkey separately or as a team? Is it better to promote reform and growth across the former Yugoslavia separately or as a team? The Ukraine case is particularly powerful, and I'd like to talk about it later, perhaps, if we have questions. But it's one of Europe's largest countries trying to find its place in the world after centuries of subjugation. And I can tell you that if I went to Kiev last week alone on behalf of Poland, I would not have got the deal. Only because I went together with colleagues from France and Germany, and with the support of the High Representative of the European Union, did we get results. Can France, UK, Germany, Italy, Poland or Hungary, acting alone or coordinating the policies and groups of countries, can help Ukraine overcome its problems? I think the answer is clear. Only by presenting a firm, united policy towards both Kiev and Moscow do we have any hope of making a difference. And it does not matter if our Eurosceptic friends complain that, in fact, the EU's offering to Ukraine has not been firm or united or credible enough, and that maybe it should have come earlier. May all be true. I myself would like to see more done to step up Europe's engagement with Ukraine, as no doubt would most Hungarians. I hope everyone in this room. But imperfect as our policy up to now may have been, it's orders of magnitude more likely to be effective than a fragmented, dispersed effort with each EU capital taking its own position. The Eastern European issues inherited from the collapse of European communism should remain at the top of Europe's foreign policy agenda in the coming years. It's our shared political and moral responsibility to deploy the diplomatic energy and resources needed to get this right, to finish the business of our victory in the Cold War. Summing up, what we presumed hardened Eurosceptics have agreed so far is two things. Number one, we want to have foreign policies, and we need to pool our efforts to make a difference. This prompts new questions. Is the way we now pool our efforts through the EU's structures and treaties the best way to get results? And if not, what is more likely to be more successful? And does not the very fact of the European External Action Service's existence undermine member states' foreign policy impact? Let me give you some numbers. There are roughly 2,000 External Action Service officials working in 141 delegations outside the EU's own area. There are many more member states diplomats doing the same in over 5,000 missions abroad. So classic bilateral diplomacy is certainly not dying. Far from it. The fact that we have both the External Action Service teams and bilateral diplomats pressing shared European positions throws more weight in what we are doing. That said, maybe there is just a bit of duplication and wasted money in having so many diplomats from so many EU member states doing much the same things. In New York, there are 24 EU consulates. In Shanghai, 21. That's a lot of diplomatic office space. And I'm just wondering whether we really need all of it. Couldn't we co-locate some of them and share services to raise our joint profile? In many Eastern European and Asian missions, the consular section, the people dealing with Europeans who get into trouble overseas, is by far the largest section of a representation. European governments already share resources on the ground to help each other in crisis situations, to help evacuate people or deliver emergency help. Is it really so ridiculous to save some money by doing more of that in routine situations too? For example, by transferring some consular services to the External Action Service? There you have it. Our tough Eurosceptics reply, the External Action Service is just trying to take a life of its own and squeeze out bilateral diplomats and national diplomacy. It's a fair point to some extent, but that's why the External Action Service was designed to include a strong proportion of personnel seconded from member states. And indeed, it does just that. The very composition of the External Action Service exemplifies what the European Union's foreign policy is all about. A clever, flexible combination of EU-level philosophy plus the varied insights that member states' own diplomats bring. Well, that's okay, I suppose, the Eurosceptics might reply, but the External Action Service reduces the scope for individual EU member states taking sovereign decisions in their own interests. To which I say, nonsense. Take the military intervention in Libya. It showed the willingness of some EU countries to press ahead and take risks on their own responsibility. Other EU member states decided to take the pass. So there was nothing limiting the sovereignty of the member states. European capitals of all shapes and sizes cannot have it both ways. Sometimes tough problems require tough decisions. But we are not really set up to take them in a smart way. Why not have EU defense ministers meeting regularly in their own EU Council, or bring them in more regularly to Foreign Affairs Council meetings? Another example, look at how the EU has made a difference in managing Iran, where I'm going in a week's time. The three EU member states with the biggest clout joined forces to sit round the table with the United States, China, and Russia. Catherine Ashton, representing the EU as a whole, likewise has played an influential personal role in helping to broker a deal. What's not to like about imaginative teamwork that gives us the best of all worlds? Sharp, nimble, bilateral diplomacy by three major EU member states, reinforced by the wider weight of the rest of the Union as expressed via the External Action Service. All that backed by the persuasive power of sanctions agreed jointly from the largest economy on earth. It was only that that was effective. Think what the effect would have been of even the largest EU states, Germany or France or Britain, imposing sanctions on their own. They could not have achieved it. As William Hague put it in October 2011, discussing Syria, quote, EU procedures can be cumbersome, slow, and bureaucratic, but when you've negotiated them, 95% of the sales of crude oil are stopped because 27 nations at that time act together. Again, views differ on the substance of what has been achieved in Iran. Some think that Iran has done too well, or that the outcome is merely delaying the next crisis. But diplomacy is all about doing what you can do, even if you think that this Iran deal is suboptimal. Don't sit muttering on the sidelines of history. Show us a better way for European countries to tackle that problematic portfolio and have a real impact. Can anyone do that? I don't think so. Why? Because there isn't one. Iran and Libya and Egypt and Syria remind us of another feature of global diplomacy these days. Precisely because the Europeans had such wide global empires, many countries around the world don't want to listen to what they regard as lecturing by former imperial powers. This is another reason for having a two-pronged approach, bringing together bilateral energy, insight, and influence with a more generalized, fluffy European message. As external service diplomats can be more credible than some national diplomats in projecting a policy of human rights, transparency, dialogue, and reconciliation around the world. They do not walk into a room representing any one former colonial power. They bring with them the possibility of generous project funds or other practical support, pooled and administered by 28 member states, and delivered with world-class transparency. There are no former colonial hidden agendas at play. To conclude, what do Eurosceptics want from foreign policy work? They want freedom of action to take clear position when their country's national interests are at stake. They want to share foreign policy resources with friendly partners to get maximum impact. And they want flexibility to work as smaller teams with key players. They are ready to share intelligence information tightly with key partners where this makes operational sense. They want robust arrangements to make sure that the EU's shared institutional foreign policy structures do not squeeze out bilateral diplomacy, but complement it. They are open to the idea of setting up shared diplomatic premises in some countries with European partners or the External Action Service to save money on overheads and to make Europe's local diplomatic visibility more impressive. Perhaps above all, if they are citizens of EU member states that have established powerful positions at the UN or their own regional clout in Latin America or Africa or the Middle East, they want their national governments to keep those advantages. This is a long list of Eurosceptic requirements, and it coincides impressively what we actually now have. As the relative weight of Europe in global councils falls for economic and demographic reasons, is anything obviously better than this? Anything available? I don't think so. Are there ways to make all this even better, to get more healthy diplomatic juice from our 28 oranges of bilateral diplomacy? And a large watermelon of shared EU action? Probably. We need to discuss it, and I hope the Danube Institute provides a valuable formula and platform to make the discussion useful. Thank you very much. Sure. We all know the outlines of what happened in Ukraine, so if there are any specific questions, I'll be very happy to answer.
Adam Labor from The Economist. I'm sure you saw it's been widely reported that a microphone was left on, and in fact you told the protesters that they had to accept the deal, otherwise there'd be martial law and they may well end up being dead. Is that a fair representation of what you were telling the protesters, or was that an isolated snippet?
It was an isolated snippet, but I did say it. And it wasn't a diplomatic maneuver, it was my judgment at that particular minute of the dilemma. The situation was moving incredibly fast. But remember, 3 factors. Number one, you have to trust me that we were getting signals that Interior Ministry troops were being secretly introduced into the city. Number 2, I actually saw some of those killers, and I even tweeted photographs of some of those guys with sniper rifles and machine guns, and you know, they were killing people at that time. And not everybody noticed the fact of weird personnel changes by President Yanukovych in the command of the armed forces. The previous day he changed the chief of the general staff, and that morning he changed the deputy chief of the general staff as well. So much so that something unprecedented happened. Both the Secretary General of NATO, and this is the unprecedented bit, it's unprecedented in my memory, that the Supreme Allied Commander Europe tweeted that the Ukrainian army must not get involved in politics. I can't remember of any other instance.
What is the significance of that tweet?
Well, they were getting information too, that there was pressure on the army to get involved. You know, when you change your chief of staff and your deputy chief of staff, either because you're preparing orders that you suspect they might not carry out, or because you've already given those orders and they haven't carried them out. So the danger of Yanukovych using his remaining forces was high, and my calculation was that the opposition rejecting the deal would have made the introduction of those orders higher. Because Yanukovych, at that time, we are talking minutes, okay? But the sequence was that an hour earlier, Yanukovych published on his website that he is shortening his term of office. So he was trying to get the upper hand, the moral high ground. You know, I'm being reasonable, I'm making a concession, and look, those people rejecting that, well, therefore we have no choice. We have to clamp down even harder. And that was the danger. And you know, I'm a solidarity man. In Poland in 1981, we thought the regime was on its last legs in December. And that's exactly when the regime introduced martial law. And it took us 8 years to get back to the negotiating table and to make a deal which very quickly turned into a rout of the communists. And indeed, that's what happened in Ukraine.
Peter Modeli, for that HU, Hungarian online press. I'm interested in were the Russians involved that night in the debate? them, or did you meet with any of the Russian diplomats that night? And what do you think about that? Mr. Lavrov has said that the opposition just broke the deal.
Well, the answer to the first question is yes. When we negotiated with President Yanukovych, he left the room several times to talk to Chancellor Merkel, to talk to Vice President Biden, and to talk to President Putin. And during one of those talks, they agreed that Russia would send a special envoy who arrived late that night. It was Ambassador Vladimir, I think, Lukin, former ambassador to the US, who, I have to say, was very constructive and helped to arrive at the deal and actually helped to overcome some sticky points in the agreement. And at dawn, actually initialed the agreement. He then received instructions from Moscow not to sign it on the grounds that, well, never mind, but you know, he didn't sign it in the end. And I thought that was a good thing, because Ukraine needs to have reasonable relations with Russia. You know, they need the lower gas price. Ideally, they need Russia to continue to buy their bonds. Russia is an important trade partner, and Russia has proven that that she has important media and political leverage in Ukraine, and Ukraine doesn't want that leverage to be used against the unity of the country. So I thought, for example, yesterday's statement by the acting head of state, Mr. Turchinov, that he wants his country to return to the European path, but also to have reasonable relations with Russia, was exactly right. And what was the other question? Oh, the breaking of the agreement. By the first sentence of the first point of the agreement, the 2004 constitution should have been voted upon and signed by within 48 hours of the agreement, which is to say by 4 o'clock yesterday. And Parliament passed it within 2 hours of the agreement. But Mr. Yanukovych hasn't signed it, not to my knowledge. So whatever you may accuse the opposition of, we know this for sure, that Mr. Yanukovych has broken the agreement. Frankly, I think the agreement has been superseded by events. But certainly Mr. Yanukovych did not fulfill his part of it. I still think Ukraine needs the spirit of the agreement, you know, non-violence, compromise, inclusiveness, tolerance of national minorities. But I would be surprised if anybody tried to follow the letter of it. Let's be.
the former president of the Sofitel Foundation. I'm just wondering that. Do you think that the future of Ukraine could be the cornerstone of the relationship between the EU and Russia?
Well, I think the Russians are overreacting to what the EU is trying to achieve in Ukraine. You know, the association agreement is. There's a lot of nice rhetoric in the association agreement, but when you get right down to it, it's a free trade agreement. And free trade is not directed against anybody. You know, we have many times more trade with Russia since we joined, since we signed our association agreement with the EU, and even since we joined. And I'm sure the same goes for Hungary. We can prove it to the Russians that they will benefit economically from this agreement. But at the same time, I don't think we should apologize for the fact that, you know, we want our neighbors to be more like ourselves. We want them to be democratic, liberal, fight corruption, and to grow in prosperity. And we think that greater association with Europe achieves that. And I just don't think we need to apologize for that. That's in our interests, and we should defend it.
My name is Mark. I have questions for you. What do you think about what are the prospects of the Polish minority? And the second one is, would you like to comment on the Eurasian Union? Is it a threat to the united Europe?
Well,
Robert, could you be kind and just repeat the question?
sure. Polish minority and Eurasian Union. Ukraine is a sort of mini multi-ethnic empire herself. You have many minorities there. And look, I reminded them just yesterday that Ukraine is a member of the Council of Europe. And therefore it is treaty bound to respect the Council of Europe rules on regional languages, on respect of ethnic minorities. And we should communicate it very clearly to the Ukrainians, A, that it's tactically in their interest to do it, but B, that it's also not only morally right, but their legal duty to do so. And any attempt to homogenize Ukraine on a sort of nationalist basis would be a terrible mistake. Look at Transnistria, Abkhazia, South Ossetia, and to some extent Belarus. We have either frozen conflicts or dictatorship because early post-communist governments got dizzy with success and tried to homogenize those areas according to some nationalist idea. And the reaction was powerful, and we have those problems ever since. And on Eurasian Union, well, then don't expect me to share the ambition of restoring a multi-ethnic, multinational grouping under the leadership of Moscow, because I think the opposite should happen. I think it would be in Russia's interest and our interest for Russia to become a candidate member of the West. For Russia to start fulfilling the criteria of membership in Western organizations. We have that to some extent with WTO. And Ukraine, I think, gives hope that Russia might one day take that road too. That is precisely why Russian leadership fears the developments in Ukraine. They know exactly what we are doing. They know that we want Ukraine to become democratic, law-abiding, and successful under a liberal, transparent, non-corrupt regime. And they fear that their people might like that too. And it's a sort of, we thought that history was at an end 20 years ago, but actually this is an ideological challenge. And they are right to be worried.
I think one more question.
John, you have the... All right.
Ferenc Körte, director of the Institute of Philosophy and Science. Two questions. One is, how do you see the prospect of the constitutional future of Ukraine? Do you hope for any federal system to be appearing on the scene or not? The other one is the role of the V4 countries. I see that your role in this whole procedure might draw attention to the Central European countries and whether they have any prospect for taking a role to negotiate in this part of Europe.
On the first one, I'm intellectually torn on this issue of federalism in Ukraine. Because on the one hand, when you have a country that is so varied, it seems sort of sensible to have federalism, but I've also heard the view that Ukraine is not a consolidated state yet, and that the unity of the country would be severely tested if you tried that. So I would be careful with that. I think the maximum leeway on issues of culture, language, and so on, but once you start creating federal structures, you don't know where you might end up. And on our role, well, look, I dragged to Kiev the big boys, because that was the way to show that EU as a whole was at last reacting, was at last intervening. And I think that worked rather well. But I think now that we have soon, I hope, a transitional government, I think the potential role of V4 will actually be bigger, because we in our region have a unique database of transition technologies, of examples to follow and examples to avoid. All kinds of things have. Ukraine is basically like us, but 20 years earlier, and they will need to decide all kinds of things. You know, what is the relationship between a democratic state and the media? What to do about ill-gotten property? What to do about security services and their files? What to do about the judiciary that until last week was handing out unfair judgments on the protesters? What to do about various other aspects of the state? How to deal with the imminent bankruptcy of the state? In Hungary it wasn't so, but Poland in 1989, when we regained our freedom, was bankrupt. So much more similar to Ukraine. How to build the consensus to carry out, to do what's necessary. I think we have much more to teach them by example than the Germans or the French or the Americans. And they will, of course, make their own decisions, but they can see what worked and what didn't. So we've provisionally agreed with Janusz actually to go to Kiev before too long to offer our good offices.
Just stay there for a moment.
First of all, I want to thank you very much indeed for a marvellous talk, both for your answers to the questions on the matter of the day of Ukraine, but also for this thorough, considered and very interesting and I hope not persuasive talk criticising the Eurosceptics. I have to say, I hope I applauded with every appearance of compliance, and I certainly don't complain. You took my words, you shaped them into a scimitar, you made a series of impressive passes in the air. It went near to my neck, didn't feel anything, but I'm really afraid to nod my head. So I want to say, first of all, thank you very much for coming. Thank you for treating us to such an impressive and interesting speech. Thank you for dealing with the questions. I would carry on much longer, except that we don't have much time for you to have dinner, and I think it will be a crime for you to be invited to Budapest and not being given a good Hungarian meal. So thank you very much indeed.
Thanks.
Ladies and gentlemen, bon appétit. That concludes the official part of the evening, and now you're entitled to enjoy the meal. Thank you.